Welcome everyone to today's meeting of the Glendale Water and Power Commission for Monday, January 7th, 2013. My name is Deborah Dentler. I'm a commissioner and I will be chairing today in the absence of our president, Zenko Armenian, who couldn't attend today. We're also missing one other person, but I think we have a quorum, so may we have the roll call, please?
Commissioner Jimian?
Present.
President Armenian? Commissioner Dentler?
Present.
Commissioner Yao? Commissioner Chan?
Present. Thank you. As much as we do have a quorum, we could move on to item 2A. However, I'm going to exercise my discretion as chair for today and propose that we continue approval of the minutes for the meetings of November 5 and December 3rd, 2012, unless I hear any objection. And the reason for that is that a number of us were missing, or some of us were missing from one of those meetings, others from the other meeting, and today we have 2 members of the commission missing. So unless I hear any objection, I'm going to table that item. Hearing none, we'll move on to item 3.
3A, Charter Ballot Initiative.
Ms. Dentler, members of the Commission, as we talked about at last month's meeting, there was a number of discussions with the City Council regarding some charter amendments, and that they had been approved by the Council to move forward. And as I promised you, I would bring the knowledgeable staff members here tonight to give you an overview of what is being proposed. Ms. Godinez is going to start it off, and we also have Mr. Elliott, our Finance Director, to make a presentation and answer any questions you have.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Commission members and members of staff. My name is Christine Godinez. I'm Senior Assistant City Attorney. And at your request, we've put together a brief presentation giving you an update on what the City Council decided as far as potential amendments to the Charter to be placed on the ballot. At the November 27th, 2012 City Council meeting, the City Council made a few key determinations. They decided to place 3 proposed charter amendments on the ballot. So there's Measure A, or I should say Charter Amendment A, which would change the city treasurer position from an elected to an appointed position. There's Charter Amendment B, which changes the fund structure of the charter to comply with generally accepted accounting principles and clarifies existing language regarding the GWP transfer. And that's what we'll spend most of our time on today. And then the third is some cleanup to accounting and finance provisions, most of which don't concern Glendale Water and Power. The measures will be on the April 2nd, 2013 election, the part of the general municipal election. And if anyone wanted to get more background on what the City Council decided, here are some of the key City Council meeting dates where there was a discussion of these matters. October 9th, November 13th, and November 27th. You could go to the city's website and click on Agendas and Minutes. And there's actually a link there if you wanted to watch the video so you could see any commentary, any discussion, what exactly transpired. Okay, so on the 27th, they authorized the placing on the upcoming municipal election on April 2nd, measures A, B, and C, which I just described briefly. They directed the city attorney to prepare an impartial analysis of the measures, which our office will undertake. And lastly, they called upon interested persons or associations that may wish to prepare arguments in support of or against those 3 proposed amendments to submit those requests by today, by close of business today. And then at the upcoming City Council meeting next week, the City Council will decide who will prepare those analyses for and against the measures. Okay, and just so that you have a full understanding of what these are, again, I'm not going to go into great detail related to the non-GWP proposed amendments, but here's the wording for Charter Amendment A. It simply would convert the position of city treasurer from elected to appointed, to be appointed by the city manager and that's the basis of that particular amendment. Charter Amendment B, which is of more concern to Glendale Water and Power, cleans up and amends certain provisions of Article 11, primarily, of the Glendale Charter to make it consistent with generally accepted accounting principles and to clarify existing language related to the transfer. This is largely, and we'll talk about it in more detail in a second, but it collapses the funds into a fewer number of funds to simplify matters to make it more consistent with generally accepted accounting principles. In Charter Amendment C, again, these are accounting cleanup matters, such as getting rid of a provision related to petty cash handling. There is a provision related to bond funding that is relevant to GWP, and it allows for greater flexibility in the way that the city procures bonds. So where we are now, as far as how we have our account structure set up, there are 10 funds that are identified in the charter that are required to be maintained. And the structure is really unwieldy and not compliant with generally accepted accounting principles. And so that's why there's this proposal to amend it. For example, we've got the waterworks and electric works, we've got the depreciation fund, we've got the sinking fund, we've got a whole slew of funds that are really not necessary. And so it's much simpler to clean that up and to just maintain 2 funds, one for water and one for electric. The city, in addition to these 10 funds, there are 62 funds that we're required to have either for legal reasons outside of the charter or because we need to comply with our reporting obligations such as the CAFR, or just because it makes sense from an accounting standpoint. So it's a very complex system as it is. Again, the accounting provisions as they are now are out of date and not consistent with generally accepted accounting principles, so that's the reason for the Amendment B in particular to the charter. I want to really dwell on the GWP related provisions, but just to highlight some of the changes. One of the changes would eliminate general budget fund and general reserve fund as separate funds. There would instead just be a general fund. And the charter would provide that the stated purpose of the general fund is to account for all financial resources and expenditures except those required to be accounted for in another fund, such as the electric and the waterworks funds, and to report such operating results of said general fund. And then there is, in Section 15, new Section 15, there would be an other funds provision which provides some flexibility to the council to maintain funds as required by law, as consistent with generally accepted accounting principles or standards, or as determined by the City Council. So it allows for a little bit of flexibility that is not necessarily there right now. It also contains an explicit provision allowing council to establish cash reserve policies, and so that would be the new Section 15. More specifically with respect to water and power, currently there are 6 funds required of the charter for Glendale Water and Power. We've got, and we've talked about this previously in connection with the transfer, we've got the waterworks and the electric works revenue funds, we've got the waterworks and the electric works depreciation funds, we've got a sinking fund, and we've got a surplus fund. The way it would be with the proposed amendments, if passed by the voters, is that there would be 2 funds. There would be the water utility fund and the electric utility fund. So all of those functions that those 6 funds have would now be collapsed into the 2 funds. And I apologize for the small text. This is just to show you specifically what the wording would be. I've also given you an attachment that has all of the proposed strikeout language to the charter, and I've put some in the back for anybody that's interested, and I understand it'll be posted online as well for anybody that wants to take a closer look. This was part of the council presentation on November 27th, so anyone that's interested can also look at it there. So you'll see this describes that there's going to be an electric and a waterworks fund, actually utility fund, not works fund, and describes the uses that those funds can be put to, which are really all of the functions that were covered by the previous sections of, by the previous funds that existed before. So, for example, the operating revenue payment of operating expenses, that would be something that would have come out of the Electric Works or the Water Works Revenue Fund. Repairs, maintenance, extensions, and improvements could also have come out of the Electric Works or Water Works Fund, or out of the sinking fund, or out of the depreciation fund. And payment of bonds and interest, that would be out of the sinking fund, and the reserve balance, that would have been previously under the surplus fund. Okay, and I also want to describe to you the proposed changes to the provision of the charter related to the transfer. There are 2 paragraphs, and I divided it into 2 slides. So the initial part of this section, which is Article 11, Section 2, is stricken from the, is part of the proposed amendment. And the language that is stricken is the language that creates and describes the surplus fund. The reason for this is because the surplus fund would be collapsed and form part of the Electric Works Fund and the Water Utility Fund. So the surplus fund would no longer be a separate fund. The second paragraph of this provision relates to the transfer itself. And in the very first line, you can see that the wording "at the end of each fiscal year" is stricken. And the reason for that is to allow for the transfer to take place at the beginning of the year rather than at the end of the year, as the current transfer language provides. So this is a procedural change to the language. The word "gross" is added in the second line before operating revenues to clarify that the transfer is derived from gross revenue. Operating revenue, as defined, means gross revenue, not net revenue. The addition of the word "gross" just simply clarifies that that is not only the intent that was in place when this provision was put into law by the voters, but also just provides further clarification should there be any doubt as to what that term means. Farther down, there's, let's see, excluding receipts from water and power supplied to other cities or utilities, and then says shall be transferred, and we have stricken there said GWP surplus fund to the general reserve fund, again to maintain consistency with the changes in which funds would exist if the amendments are adopted. And it says, as determined by the budget process, consistent with the change to the first line, which would reflect that the transfer is to occur at the beginning of the fiscal year, at the time that the budget process is undertaken. And the change from the ensuing to such fiscal year is just clarifying, making the language more clear so we know what we're talking about. The last change, if there are no questions, I don't know if you want to pause there.
I do have a question. Has it always been the 25%?
No, it has not. Originally, it was 12% when it was adopted in 1941.
Right.
And then in 1949, it was increased to the 25%.
What year was that again?
1949?
1949, and went to 25? Mm-hmm. And it's been 25 since then, every year.
It's been 25 since then, correct.
From what I can remember, we had the city manager here in one meeting, I think sometime last year, where he mentioned the amount is going to be changed from year to year. Do you recall that?
Yes, Commissioner Chan.
How will that get factored in?
From a budgetary standpoint, we've made a commitment to try to lower the amount.
Right.
And this year in our budget, we included a nominal amount of $250,000. We hope to double that next year and then progressively continue to get that down to a number that's probably, I think, goal-wise, we were looking at somewhere more around that 10 to 12% range.
Okay, so then this 25% would not apply anymore.
Well, you know, and the way it reads, that you raise a really good point. The way it reads is it says an amount equal to 25%. But there's wording that says that provided, however, that the city council can take a look at it and say, we don't think that it's in the sound, financial interest of the utility to transfer the full 25%. So that is retained.
Okay.
And in fact, now we're not transferring the full 25% and haven't been
Right.
for some time.
Right, and where in this charter does that say that, where the city council will review and change if need be?
If I may add, at the end of each year, the council has to do a finding for an amount to lower below 25%. So we take a report every June to equate to whatever the transfer has been for the previous year, and it's been about 14% the last several years. But we have to, the charter says you transfer 25% unless the council finds for a lesser amount. So we take that report back every year. What some of the cleanup is we're suggesting is we just determine what that is during the budget process, eliminate that year-end report, and basically, if we're going to transfer, 12, 13, 14%, whatever that is, we do it during the budget process so we can plan for that number.
Oh, I see. So that's just done informally, and that's not written in the
No,
charter?
it's right here, as determined by the budget process, and then later on,
Right, where it says
in
provided
the
that.
opinion of the city.
Oh, I see. It's in the
to be-
exhibit.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Sure. The last proposed change to the charter that I wanted to touch upon would be part of the Amendment C, and this is what I was briefly describing related to the bonds. So currently, the way the charter reads with respect to issuance of bonds for GWP is that you have to go to a public sale, sort of akin to what you would do for construction bidding. And it's a very a natural process, if you will, with respect to bonds. It's much cleaner and more consistent with modern practice to allow for negotiation of bonds where appropriate. So this change would allow for that.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to keep up with flipping through our handout versus the PowerPoint. So the accounting and finance is, if you could direct us to a page.
So that's on the final page of the handout, page 14, which the top says Section 4, Limitations on Issuance. And if you look at paragraph 3, that's where the amendment is.
I see. Thank you. So the PowerPoint is just a summary of what's being proposed
Exactly.
on page 14. Thank you.
So the next steps, as I mentioned, today is the deadline for anyone that wanted to submit a argument for or against the proposed amendments to submit their expression of interest to the city clerk. And then next week, on the 15th, the city council is going to designate persons to write those arguments. And on the 25th, the arguments will be due to the city clerk. And then the election will take place on April 2nd. And with that, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Questions, anyone? No? Thank you so much. I have no speaker cards on this item, so we'll move forward to the next item. 3B?
3B, Water Services Division update.
Madam President Pro Tem, members of the Commission, as part of our overall restructuring, we talked a little bit about some of the individual divisional changes we'd made, and that I would come back periodically and give you updates both on those divisional changes and then the departmental changes as a whole. So Mr. Boeg drew the first straw, and here he is tonight to give you an update on what the water division highlights are for the current period.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Ramona Boeg, Assistant General Manager in Glendale Water and Power. I won't go over the report that you normally get here on a monthly basis. I mean, it's something that if you have questions, please feel free to call me. But what I want to talk about is organizationally what we've been doing on the water department since I've taken over. You can probably call this my 90-day report, very short and brief. And so what we're doing with the water department is we have been looking at other agencies for best practices, trying to learn from what others have done. We've looked at the organization, we've reorganized a little bit. For example, the water quality department, which used to be housing engineering, is now part of operations, where it should be because it's really part of the operations. But the main thing that's happening, as you know, is we have the $35 million bond financing that we acquired recently. We're going to council on the 15th. The 22nd, the 22nd Because when we submitted the budget last year for this fiscal year, we went with a zero-based capital project. With the bond financing, we are appropriating what we know we can get done for the first half or the second half of this year. So we're looking at about $5 million worth of funds that we're going to start doing. So part of that, we are developing a 5-year plan. Although the bond is only good for 3 years, the commitment we made to you is we're going to spend the bond finance money for the first 3 years and come up with a plan so we can go on a pay-as-you-go program on our capital programs. Having said that, our O&M, we have not lacked on the O&M. We continue to perform the O&M. And based on the experience we have so far, with the exception of incidental or accidental pipe breaks, we haven't had any major events or any major problems in the last 90 days. And what I'd like to do is, I'm giving an overview, but in the next reports we'll be providing you more details. And so if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them at this time.
I do have one question. In the reorganization, we lost our most senior water engineer, and I was wondering, from your point of view, under the new organization that you're now at the helm of the water activities, do you feel any, or do you have any sense yet on how the water side of the utility is doing in the absence of that senior executive and any others that lost their positions? And I know in our last meeting there had been some discussion, though personnel is not in our purview, and that's not my intention to get into that area, but Mr. Zern had indicated the possibility of bringing some people back potentially, and I was wondering how that is looking from your point of view.
Yeah, technically we have the talent that we have in-house, and what they're lacking or what they needed some direction, that's where the 5-year planning or strategic planning that we're developing. I'm able to give them directions, but in terms of the technical knowledge, in-house knowledge, that had remained in-house. We haven't lost any of the technical knowledge or institutional knowledge for that matter. So we're doing pretty well.
And Madam President Pro Tem, just to add, we are bringing back a water quality management position. So we're in the process of recruiting for that. That's one that we lost due to the retirements.
Right.
And Mr. Boeg and I thought that that's a critical issue and a critical area, so that we are going to be hiring back a program management specialist.
That's correct.
That's the name of the term, that will be dedicated to water quality. From the engineering side, yes, I agree wholeheartedly with Mr. Boeg. We are doing very well there and have really good talent. I'm very, very proud of them.
Thank you so much. Any other questions?
All right. Thank you very much.
Moving on to the next agenda item, 3C, please.
3C, coal contracts update.
Madam President Pro Tem and members of the Commission, this is, I remember this being asked for when I first attended my first meeting with the GWP Commission, but just an overall update of where we are in relation to the energy we purchase and use that is derived from coal-fired operations. And we obviously have interests that we own in a couple different facilities. And as you know, with the greenhouse gas reduction legislation that's in place and the cap and trade program and many others, that we're in the process of slowly weaning ourselves off of coal-produced electricity. So Mr. Linz is here to give you where we're at today. We don't have a real specific plan of where we're going in the future, because a lot of these contracts are well into the 2020, 2025 area. We are working with the City of Los Angeles through our SCAPA agency, and on looking at somewhat of what the future holds for us. But somewhere between non-coal produced electricity and meeting our renewable mandate, we're going to slowly work our way off the coal. But Mr. Linz is going to give you an overview of where we're at today.
Members of the Commission, Steve Linz, Chief Assistant General Manager for GWP, and as Mr. Zern indicated, I'm just going to give you a little update on where we are with our coal-fired generation resources. In summary, I'll talk a little bit about the issue related to greenhouse gas allowances. We'll talk about our two coal projects, which is the Intermountain Power Project and our San Juan project, and the issues related to those two projects. This November, we had our first auction of greenhouse gas allowances, and Glendale actually sat out the auction. We deposited our allowances directly into our compliance account, but the price at the auction basically was close to the minimum, $10. In the secondary market, those prices have gone up to as high as $14, and we expect that price to move around a bit. Glendale has been allocated most of the allowances we think we'll need through 2020. We're not sure what's going to happen after 2020, but we're planning on there not being more free allowances given at that time.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'm so sorry. I know you're on a roll.
No problem.
And I read your report and I saw the PowerPoint. But if I could just ask you from the point of view of the public and myself, since I'm no expert, could we back up to just getting a really brief explanation of some of the terminology? I certainly I can hardly be alone in not really understanding how the auctions work and some of the terms you're using. If you don't mind, we have such a short agenda today, so if I could ask you to maybe give us a little overview of the terminology and just how the system works when you say auction, some of the other terms that are coming up.
Okay, well, I'll go back, I guess, to the law, AB 32, that was passed. That
Very broadly
basically
speaking.
said we have to reduce our emissions to 1990s levels. And so some technical folks went back and figured out how many tons you would have to reduce to be at that level. And
How many tons of carbon emissions?
How many tons of carbon emissions you would have to be at 1990 emissions levels. And so the California Energy Commission looked at how can we reduce those emissions. Some of the things they did were renewable portfolio standard, so that we were generating with some emission-free resources. And then that reduced the emissions a certain amount, and then there was a certain amount left, and they decided to deal with that with a cap-and-trade system. Basically says, you know, you only have so many allowances out there for carbon, and it's based on historical averages. And then they reduce those, the amount of allowances available every year over time, kind of in a glide path. And people either have to cover their emissions using allowances that are allocated to them, or they have to just go out and buy those allowances.
And when you say people, you mean utilities?
Utilities or manufacturers, anybody that has an industry or something that produces emissions.
Produces emissions, thanks. And when you say they said, you mean the Energy Commission?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Thank you so much. So, and then auction, when you say auction and the bids and the minimum bids, just briefly, what's an auction?
An auction at the state is a mechanism to sell these allowances through a state auction mechanism, and they offer them to the market, and people that need them can go in and buy them. And even those that don't need them can go in and buy them, like marketers.
And the auctions happen on what kind of intervals?
Quarterly.
Thanks.
But we just had the first one this November.
Okay, thank you.
And then there's a secondary market as well
All right,
throughout the year.
thanks. I know I interrupted your train of thought.
Okay, that's okay. That's all I'm going to say on allowances. So we have a power plant called San Juan. It's in New Mexico, Farmington, New Mexico. It's about 10% of our retail load. We bring that energy across transmission lines through Arizona and back here to serve the residents in Glendale. The cost is around $70 to $90 a megawatt hour. And there's a couple of things impacting that plant right now. One is some state legislation called SB 1368. And it basically says that if we're going to make improvements on the plant that extend the life more than 5 years, then we've got to go to the CEC and let them know what we're doing and get approval. And the The EPA basically has been pushing on this issue. They filed a docket at the California Energy Commission saying they want us to do more documentation of the projects that we are completing at the plant.
When you say they want us to, us meaning Glendale Water and Power, or utilities in general?
All of the utilities that are participants in the San Juan plant.
Okay.
There's 4 big units there. There's a number of participants, including Scapa, Glendale, Anaheim, and some other cities.
Thanks.
As well.
Quick question. Is the point of if you're making improvements over 5 years, and all of those improvements have to be approved by a certain body, is the point of that for them to see why you're improving over 5 years, because they don't really want you to make improvements on these plants? They want you to kind of slowly shut them down over the years?
Yes.
Okay. So they want to make sure you're not extending it over 30 years. Okay. Got it.
A lot of detail here that I don't think I'm going to go into. That's one big issue. Another big issue is that EPA has filed a suit against us. There was a resolution of that suit, or settlement, that basically said that the power plant has to put some emissions control equipment on the units. And that the order said that they wanted us to put selective catalytic reduction on those units, which would cost somewhere around $800 million to $1 billion. The plant operator and others say, well, no, we can put selective non-catalytic reduction equipment on there that cost about 1/10 of that. So we are in the middle of that dispute, and it's in court, and we're trying to settle those issues. So some of the scenarios for settling that issue include shutting down there's 4 big units there. Some of the scenarios include shutting down a couple units and then putting that selective non-catalytic reduction on the other 2, shutting down 1, putting SNCR on the other 3. All of these scenarios would allow potentially someone like Glendale to exit the project.
Mm-hmm. And that's because it would result in a change of the contractual agreement? You say
Yes.
would allow us to exit?
Yes, there'd be a settlement. There'd be a whole new set of contracts that would implement that settlement and potentially give us the opportunity to exit that project. So we're looking at that. We're looking at doing some repowering at the Intermountain power plant with natural gas, which has much lower emissions, and hopefully maybe move some of that coal to natural gas. And so I'm going to jump here into the Intermountain power project. This project, we have a long-term contract. We don't own it like we do with San Juan. As Mr. Zern mentioned, the existing contract goes into 2027. We've got 36 megawatts of generation, and this is about 25% of our retail load. And you may or may not recall some of the prior content labels, power content labels, but our system's generally around 30 to 35% coal now, depending on the output of the 2 plants.
You're zipping along, so I just want you to ask you to slow back down for 1 second on the
Okay.
percentages. Sorry. Roughly 25% of our retail load is not coal, but rather coal energy from this Intermountain power project, right?
Well, you see the last bullet point here shows that we get about 230,000 to 290,000 megawatt hours of energy from this coal generator. And that represents about 25% of our customers' needs for 1 year.
I heard that, and then you went into, and then also in the 30% range, and that's where I lost you.
Yeah, then I was saying that you may have recall seeing our power content label that we file every year with the CEC, and our total coal for the system is around 35%, 30 to 35%, which is this 25 plus the 10% from San Juan, so about 35%.
Thanks.
I mean, I'm going to skip over some of this detail unless you have questions on, the coal supplies. And I will note here that the cost of this resource is $55 a megawatt hour, which is about half what we're paying for the renewables that we're purchasing. So as we scale in more renewables, it's going to put pressure on our rates and to provide the city with energy. So right now, Los Angeles Department of Water and Power is trying to set up a coal off-ramp for the Intermountain Power Project. They'd like to decide in 2013 what we're going to do in 2027. And so they're going around to the participants and they're offering a set of repowering contracts that proposes a scenario of a gas plant at Intermountain Power Project instead of a coal plant. And so the issues for us are going to be how many megawatts do we get? What's the minimum number of megawatts you need at that site to drive the transmission that's already there? And all of these things are up in the air at the moment. We are working with LA and negotiating with the other participants to try to come up with a scenario that works for everybody. Some people want out of the project, some people want to stay in, some people want to stay in and keep the transmission but not get as much generation, and so we're working through those scenarios. I think to sum it up, as Mr. Zern said, we are trying to transition out of coal. We understand that we want to be good environmental stewards. We do have a couple of opportunities coming up in both of our coal resources. However, nothing's really going to start happening until probably 2017 or later. At this point, we're not 100% sure what the economic consequences are because we haven't had a chance to fully analyze all those scenarios, but we are moving forward with that, and our objective is to reduce emissions so that sometime after 2020, if we have to start buying greenhouse gas allowances, that we don't need that many. And I know there's a lot of detail in there. I'd be glad to answer questions. You can circle back to any of the slides if you like.
I have one question. When you and Mr. Zern said that our overall goal as a utility is to reduce, or to, as you call it, the coal off-ramp, to reduce, other than just, it's generally considered a desirable direction to head in, I understand that, but where is this goal or objective actually stated? Is it in our written policies? Is it when you say we really want to do this and this is where we're heading? Where can the public see that?
Mrs. Dendler, we don't have anything, we really are in a transition period with regards to strategic planning. Obviously, we've been pursuing our renewable portfolio standard and the mandate that's required there. By virtue of the fact of the greenhouse gas emissions reductions, it just makes sense that your biggest bang for the buck is to get off coal. Plus, there's just an overall sense from all manufacturing and utility to reduce the amount of coal that they use. Also, the City of LA is admittedly a big player in the projects that we deal with, and they have a very, very defined mandate to reduce coal. And so in many respects, they're going to be in the lead, and we're going to be following them. As Steve said, that they're leading the repowering of the IPP to gas, and so we'll be following their lead in many respects. But we don't have anything written or stated. It is going to be something as we put together and refine some of the things in our energy risk trading and our overall portfolio management that we will have as an overall objective, and show to the extent that we can where we expect to be each year with regards to renewables. Obviously, we have a mandate there, but then to what the remaining makeup of our portfolio would be. The short answer is we don't have anything written
Thanks.
down.
That's what I thought, but I wanted to check. Thanks. That's not the short answer. That's the long one, but I appreciate it. Okay. Those are my only questions.
Question.
Do we have a schedule in mind? I know with the San Juan, our contract ends 2017, and I know in the conclusions, it stated economic consequences unknown at this time, no immediate changes, work now for changes in 2017 and later. Do we have like a timeline, some sort of a schedule? What are we expecting to see by when?
That's something we're putting together right now.
Okay.
We're developing that. We don't. A lot of these things are very fluid. They're happening pretty quickly, and so we're trying to gain, first an understanding. Steve mentioned the contracts that LA has, so Mr. Lenz and his staff just trying to digest those contracts with these very short timelines that they're looking for commitments from. With San Juan, and Steve, please correct me if I'm wrong, we're waiting to see some of these EPA decisions that are made, and also, what are the fixes and what are the cost of the fixes, and if we were to exercise any option to remove ourselves from that project, what are the ramifications to the city, financially and otherwise? Can we make up those megawatts? So those are all strategic policies and schedules that we're currently working out. I tell you, when it's fluid in dealing with Mr. Peters and Mr. Lins, we're talking about this almost on a daily basis. Something comes up here, something pushes out over somewhere else. You have agencies that are dealing with this in different ways. Some are very heavy in coal. Some of our Southern California counterparts are very heavy in coal, so they're beginning to worry a little bit about what they're going to do, and they're providing opportunities for us in other areas. So it's very fluid right now, but hopefully we can get to where we have some sense of a strategic plan. And obviously it dictates, we have a 2017 number, we have a 2027 number, we have the 2013 number that LA would like some sort of a commitment on. So those timelines, we're going to have to fit it in within there. But it is really, in the time I've been here, has accelerated tremendously and changed almost on a daily basis. So it's very dynamic and very exciting, actually. But it causes us to have to sometimes make decisions, quickly. But on the other hand, look at all of the opportunities that are available to us. And you'll be hearing about that from us going forward in the future, because I imagine we'll be back with a couple of different things to talk to you about that we're pursuing, whether that's Magnolia, whether it's IPP, whether it's what we're going to do in San Juan.
Yeah, that sounds good. That is important. This is an important matter that we should be briefed. And I was just wondering, is there a way that we can kind of schedule it in? Like, what would be the amount of time that you think would be good to come back to the commission?
Sure, we can do that. We can do a quarterly update and combine maybe our renewable. I don't know if we have an update, a regular update on renewables, but include in there anything we're doing with regards to alternatives for coal,
right,
what the status of the two plants are, these two projects are. We can easily do that.
Great.
Commissioner
Thank you.
Jamie had a question?
Yeah, actually, it was very similar to what Commissioner Chen asked, but I do have one more question, which is, I know the city at one point in time was looking at a waste-to-energy plant. Is that still tabled, or what's the...
Yes, Mr. Jimmy, it is. What we've done for the last, it's probably been 2.5 years now, where we started the process of looking at some sort of a waste-to-energy, waste-to-gas plant or facility that we could build here at our own landfill, taking advantage of the fact that we own our own landfill. As you know, we harvest the gas, the methane that's created in the landfill now, and bring that down to Grayson and use that as a fuel to power the plant currently. What we've gone through is starting with 13 different firms that proposed everything from gasification to pyrolysis to anaerobic digestion. We've narrowed it down to, just based on what we think is most feasible for the city of Glendale, what we can get to quickest, and what is most acceptable to the environmental regulatory agencies. We've focused, at least initially, on anaerobic digestion.
Right.
So we're in the process now of putting out an RFP to specifically anaerobic digestion private firms to propose to us putting a facility in Glendale. And this would be organic and food waste that we would take in, green waste, some construction materials that could go in there. It produces a very rich methane gas that can be used to power facilities that generate electricity, our own, whether it goes to Grayson or we do something different directly on site. So the outlook for that is, I would imagine by the end of, probably towards the end of this year, we'd be looking at coming back to council with a decision on which way we're going to go. And then, the anaerobic digestion facilities aren't as difficult to build as some of the others are. They're much easier to permit, I can tell you that. There's actually a state EIR for anaerobic digestion facilities. It's a technology that's been used extensively in the wastewater and waste treatment business for years. So we would hope that maybe sometime next year at this time, we'd be looking at a schedule of when we could implement that at the landfill. And that would be a joint project between Public Works and Water and Power, with that fuel going towards Grayson. Or we have the ability to sell that gas as well.
Much more, yeah.
Because as the law is set up, you don't get credit. Again, Steve, correct me if I go off base here. You don't get credit for that gas unless it's produced in California. So you can't import that biogas from outside of California and have it count towards your RPS. So it makes it very valuable, both for us as a fuel to generate electricity and also something that we could sell to make a profit for the utility.
What is the potential for the Shoal Canyon to produce as far as, in terms of megawatts per hour? How many megawatts of energy can it produce with the current waste tonnage we have in the city and I guess some of the surrounding cities?
Well, with the current gas, we're producing what amounts to about 7% of our retail load. With more efficient units, we think we can get that up to 10 or another 3 or 4%. So we are looking at options to repower Grayson and have more efficient generation at the plant. I don't know the exact number of megawatt hours that is. I know that it's, 10% of our load is about 100,000 megawatt hours a year. So it's probably about 70 or 80,000 megawatt hours a year now.
Talking about the current methane gas produced at the Shoal Canyon, right?
I'm talking about the current outflow.
But
Yes.
if you were to take a look at the actual waste that's being produced now, and if you were to do anaerobic digestion with that waste, which is what I'm assuming you're talking about, what is the potential of that as far as megawatts per hour?
That's part of what this RFP process is for them to
Calculate that.
and it also depends on quality of gas and what's produced at the end and how it's cleaned and a number of other things, but that's part of this process. So we had talked about the potential for a 20 megawatt. That seems like a lot to me, but we'll see. I think it's going to be considerably less than that, but I still think it's going to be the fact that we're getting 7% out of the existing gas, and the quality of the gas that will come from an AD project is considerably richer. I mean, you can almost dictate how that gas. Today, we just take what comes up out of the landfill, and it has, we're about 30 to 32% methane on that.
330 BTU.
So it has a lot of other constituents that have to be culled out of it before we can even burn it. So with the anaerobic digestion, we have a much better opportunity to control the kind of gas that we produce, and it's much richer, higher BTU count, maybe even rich enough that we don't have to blend it. I don't know, but I don't know the exact numbers. That'll all be part of the process that the proposing firms will have to come up with and tell us, and what we'll rate them on.
And when is the plan for the RFP to come out?
The RFP should be released somewhere between the end of this month and the first couple weeks of February. And I believe we're giving them 4 months to develop 4 to 6 months to develop a program. I can't remember exactly, and then get back to us with a proposal.
Back to coal before we hear from, I have one public speaker, and then there is anyone else who came wanting to speak on this issue, fill out a speaker card. On PowerPoint slide 12, describing the Intermountain Power Project, I'm curious if you happen to know, or if you don't, you could let me know another time. On the first bullet point that mentions the multiple coal supplies in Utah and, quote, nearby states, do you happen to know if those include the states of Montana and Wyoming, which are using strip mining technology?
I don't off the top of my head. I know it's numerous states around. I didn't bring information with me on the specific coal sources.
Okay. I just thought you might, so maybe we can have that. You could let me know privately with an email, or we could just get an update the next time we get together.
Sure.
And the reason I mention that, Mr. Lenz, is that in my reading about the controversies about coal and its impact on our climate, not only our climate but also on public health, the amount of ash, the amount of energy it requires to transport the coal, the cascading effects, both health effects and economic effects that go along with our country's reliance on coal. One thing that I've learned is that as various utilities in different states try to move towards reduction of reliance on coal, that some coal operators are moving to an accelerated use of strip mining in order to generate coal, and those apparently include the states of Montana and Wyoming, and there could be others. So I would like clarification on whether the Intermountain Power Project is employing that technology, because that's an additional public health consequence, which unfortunately, as I understand it, has been sped up by the well-intended direction of, that we sound like we are all in consensus that we need to reduce our reliance on coal, but in some states this has led to accelerated strip mining. So I'm kind of curious about that. And then my second question, I guess really isn't a question, it would be more of a potential proposal for us as a commission, but I'd like to bring it back at another date when we have a fuller commission here. So perhaps when it's again coming up on our agenda, as Commissioner Chan, I think had an excellent idea to perhaps have you come back quarterly. I think this is a matter that that there's a lot of public concern about, and so in addition to bringing it back 1 quarter from now, I'll just throw this out as an idea for a future meeting. I would favor a written strategic objective built into our strategic plan as a utility, so that when our executive staff are conferring with our partner cities, other utilities, as people like Mr. Lenz are watching the transactions, that there's a clear direction potentially to come from City Council, and our role in that would be potentially to recommend the adoption of a strategic objective, so that when our representatives are dealing with the other partner cities and with suppliers, and as you're potentially looking at settling out potentially on that litigation that would help us escape that coal contract, and I don't have an opinion on that. That's not in my purview on any particular contract, but it might give you an extra tool in your tool belt, so that you would be able to say to our partners and to the attorneys handling those kinds of settlement talks, well, boy, in our city, we had a commission and a city council that was concerned enough about ensuring reliance, decreasing our reliance on coal, that we actually have a written policy in place. So just an exploratory idea I want to throw out to the commission, and food for thought.
I think LADWP made their statement with respect to coal in their updated integrated resource plan.
Yes.
And I know that we're just about to embark on a probably 1 to 1.5 year analysis of our repowering options and all of our resources, and it might be appropriate through that process to look at that issue.
Thanks. So I'd like
Excuse me, just to add, we are developing that plan, but I seriously doubt we'll be able to have it to you next quarter. It's going to be
no, I
sometime.
didn't.
Yeah.
No, I wasn't expecting
Okay.
you to produce it. I was suggesting that it might arise from the commission, that we would put on a future agenda a potential adoption by City Council of a general strategic objective in reduction of reliance of our utility on coal, just for discussion and debate at a future meeting. I'm not asking staff to do anything by the next quarterly meeting, but I would like to keep that on our agenda, and when we have a fuller commission, we can discuss that, see if there's any support for that. So I do have a public speaker card, unless any other commissioners have a question. Thank you, Mr. Lenz. I have a request from Larry Morehouse. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm glad that you brought up the question that this was a complicated item that Steve talked about here today, there's a lot of issues in this that is very complicated. There's a lot of big cost items in that that's going to take a lot of money through either bond issues or GWP revenues. So it's not a small thing that Steve put on PowerPoint here today. When I seen it on the agenda, I studied it a little bit and realized that it is quite complicated, and the average ratepayer would not understand probably very much at all of really what's on this PowerPoint. But I had 3 questions that I wanted to ask regarding the carbon emissions. One is, when will the ratepayers start seeing the cost of carbon emissions on their electric bill? These are the kinds of questions I think the ratepayer is interested in. They're not so much interested in scrubbers or repowering. They're interested in their electric bill. And at some point, I'm assuming that carbon emissions has got to show up somewhere on an electric bill, or the ratepayer has to pay for this in order to meet the mandates that the utility is up against. Number 2, on what is the anticipated cost to the average 1,000 kilowatt hour user each month? That would be the average, maybe the average ratepayer in Glendale. These are kind of things. This is the kind of thing that the ratepayer is going to be interested in when he hears the commission talk about these kinds of things. And number 3, given the status quo of all of the resources that Glendale has today, not making any changes at all, just the way everything is running and the way the utility runs today, what is the anticipated annual cost for all carbon emissions to the GWP? And that's the questions I want to make. Maybe you can answer that.
Thank you. Did the staff want to respond?
Madam President, members of the Commission, a few things. There's a lot of moving parts here. We have free allowances through 2020. So for the most part, we're generally covered. We may be a little short or a little bit long through that period, but we don't anticipate any significant impact on rates until 2020 and thereafter. And then at that point, it depends on how much we're able to reduce our emissions. If we have exited out of San Juan and IPP by that time frame, well, then there'll be a much lower impact. As you saw on this slide, the minimum is $10 per megawatt hour for carbon, and that could go as high as 50. So we don't know what that number is until we get to 2020, until we know how many emissions we have to cover, number one. Second question, same thing, we can't calculate the average impact on a 1,000 kilowatt per month user until we know those numbers. And then the third question.
Well, I'm sorry, can you hold off on going to the last question for a second? When you say we can't know, isn't it correct? Isn't it fair to say that, well, roughly 35% of the average ratepayer's electric bill reflects our reliance on coal contracts?
Yeah, yes.
I mean, that's part of the answer. If that's what the gentleman was asking, I'm not.
Well, he was
sure.
asking what's the impact on their rates. And right now, because we've been allocated free allowances through 2020, there's no rate impact until after 2020.
It might be helpful for you to explain what free allowance is.
The California Energy Commission, through the Cap and Trade program, allocated carbon allowances to utilities, publicly owned utilities, based on their historical usage through 2020. So Glendale Water and Power was allocated approximately 600,000 tons or 600,000 allowances a year every year until 2020.
That's the amount of carbon emissions that our utility is legally entitled to release into the atmosphere.
Correct.
And that will change in 2020.
It may. We
And
don't
it's-
know yet.
And because of these uncertainties, it's difficult to answer a question like Mr. Morehouse's in terms of a specific dollar impact on an average ratepayer currently or on that ratepayer in 2020.
Correct. And the third question, we lost it.
I'm sorry, I forgot.
Falls into that same category. To give a specific number, we just can't at this point in time. But, and just another note, we're going through a cost of service analysis right now as well, and we are incorporating into that what the potential impact on the utility will be for meeting, at least from this standpoint, the renewable portfolio standard that we know, 33% by 2020. And so that's included in what the economists are doing is they analyze our rates and the extent that you can segregate that out to show what it might cost us to have to meet this regulatory mandate. So as a ratepayer, ideally, and I'm not quite sure how it's all going to play out, but you'd be able to say, wow, to meet that mandate, for instance, as Mr. Lynn said, coal today is $55 a megawatt hour. Renewables are generally running about double that. So you'd be able to say, for us to meet the mandate and to begin to get ourselves off of coal, and I think this is kind of the direction Mr. Morehouse was talking about. This is the charge that goes towards meeting that mandate, and what your bill is reflecting beyond just your usage is this additional charge potentially that shows what it costs us to meet these mandates.
Mr. Morehouse didn't use his whole speaking time, so I don't want him to go. It's so nice to have a member from the public come and address us, so I'm going to maybe deviate from normal procedure since we have no one else waiting to speak, and just ask you if your questions have been
That does
answered.
answer my question, I think, 2020?
20.
Yeah. So as a ratepayer, why, I guess I can breathe a little bit until 2020. But knowing what Glendale Water and Power has to do in order to get to 2020, I used to manage a 1,200 megawatt coal-fired plant before I come to the city of Glendale, so I got a little bit of knowledge of coal. Mm-hmm. And it's a big ticket item, and it's very possible that GWP might have to start collecting some of these costs, maybe even before 2020. Maybe the consultant is maybe he's going to tell them that they're going to have to do that, because you can't do this overnight. You can't just wake up in the morning and say, well, now we're going to do this, now that. It's going to take a lot of long-range planning. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming to speak to us today. Is there anyone else who wants to be heard on this matter? We'll move on to item 4, oral communications, please.
Or oral communications?
I have no speaker card. Anyone still wishing to be heard? Moving on to item 5, agenda forecast is attached to our packet.
5, agenda forecast.
I haven't found mine. Here we are.
So we talked about the quarterly update.
Right. We'll add something that encompasses our both our renewables and where we are in relation to these larger coal projects.
Right.
Going forward. So we'll schedule that and put that on this as a going forward.
So quarterly would mean we're here in
We're January.
So April.
Yep, we'll do this one. And
It looks like we have room to squeeze it in either April or May as a very short agenda, so either of those would be fine.
For our next meeting, members of the commission, we have the energy risk management presentation. As I had indicated last month, we would tentatively put it here because it was very close to when we were making some of our final fine-tuning to that, I should say. So we are going to need to move that into the March meeting.
Okay.
Okay.
Now that leaves February a little bit light because the quarterly project scorecard update is something I believe that was related to the strategic plan, which is really no longer viable. So what I'm going to do is get back together with staff and see if we can't find, because it's going to be difficult to move some of these other items up that far into February. I'm going to find a couple of other issues that I think would be informational for the commission and put those on the agenda, and Gloria or myself will send you a note ahead of time to that extent. But we have a lot going on. I'm sure we can find some things of interest to help round out that meeting.
I'm looking in March, there's customer service update.
Mm-hmm.
Would that be able to be moved up?
It might be, Ms. Chan. It might
Okay.
be, yes.
And how about the Chromium 6 update?
We haven't had, we gave you Chrome 6 update. We haven't had much movement since, and I don't anticipate a lot of new information. I was planning, I'm not even sure by April we'll have a lot. Actually, the final report is going to be, I think it's due the end of February. So once that's done and then we get some feedback from the state, that was the time we were going to bring it back. We were kind of guessing it would be April. It may not even hit that mark. So we wanted to come back to you when we had some new information beyond what we gave you on our last update.
Then are we scheduling the energy update in April or May?
We'll do it in April. The renewable, we'll put it in for the April meeting.
Including coal?
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely, we'll have that on there. And the other thing, Ms. Dentler, is we'll have in there that same opportunity to discuss the policy development or strategic outlook.
Since we have a quorum today, let me ask my fellow commissioners if there would be support among the majority of the three of us for putting on that agenda, so that would be on the public agenda, that date we would be considering adoption of a policy statement, including a strategic objective concerning reduction of reliance on coal. Would there be support for that among the three of us? So that we could have it on the agenda for discussion?
For discussion?
Yes.
Not a final...
No, just hoping we would have a fuller
Yeah, absolutely.
that day.
And that's
so
what
that
I was referring to, is that at least we could engage in the discussion, put together the ideas of the commission, and then come back at a subsequent meeting with...
So I'd like to get something along those lines onto a public agenda so that anyone interested knows that we will at least engage in a discussion that day. And so in order to do that, we need to agendize something for an agenda. So my proposal would be to put that in on the same date that you'll be presenting us with the quarterly update.
That's
Are
fine,
we
I'll
agreed on
support that. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Any other comments on the agenda forecast? Before I consider a motion to adjourn, I just wanted to bring to my fellow commissioners' attention, and the staff and the public, that over this holiday period, I read an extraordinary article in the New Yorker magazine. I believe it might be last week's issue. I meant to bring it in, and I will bring it next time, or I may send it to the Commission and to Mr. Zern. And it describes the state of climate change science and also the impact of climate change on public safety planning in the wake of the experience of the Hurricane Sandy impact on New Yorkers and New Jersey residents. And it's quite a well-done article, and it covers a lot of the topics that the commissioners have been discussing since I've come on the commission. And I particularly wanted to highlight a lengthy discussion there about smart grid technology. I really wished that Glendale had been mentioned in the article, and I'm tempted to write a little letter to the editor, to the New Yorker, to brag about our work here in Glendale. But it has an excellent overview of the relationship between smart grid technology and emergency preparedness for our communities. It also goes on to discuss even such matters as one that was a favorite of Commissioner Chan's, the pros and cons of underground wiring, talking about the experience in some other countries. I think the Netherlands is one, and a couple of other countries are mentioned, who have moved really aggressively in this area of placing wiring underground as not just a aesthetic matter, which is in other respects that we've talked about, but also in the ability of crews to quickly respond to emergencies. As there's a wealth of topics in this extraordinary New Yorker article. So I'm going to take the liberty of sending it off to all of the members of the Commission and to Mr. Zern, because it, again, really has a way of bringing together a lot of the threads of discussion that we've had here on the Commission and putting it in the context of emergency preparedness. And one thing that came to mind in listening to our overview of coal today was a statement that the author made that concerned the long-term impacts of climate change and carbon emissions on all of our economies, our communities, public health, and more. At one point, the author notes that the effects of climate change and carbon emissions, among them, will be impacting us globally for so many centuries that any one or handful of small things that we may do in our lifetimes will be a drop in the bucket in terms of addressing what would be, we're looking ahead at many centuries of impact. So the author argues for planning infrastructure changes in our, and changes in our response as communities, as human beings, gearing up to develop new ways of dealing with public safety emergencies that are generated by things like hurricanes and flooding and climate change impacts, while we are searching for ways to reduce our reliance on things like coal. So I invite everyone to go grab the New Yorker, but I'll be sending it around. And I really wish it had mentioned Glendale in its overview of smart grid technology. So, thank you. That's my speech on that. And I will entertain a motion to adjourn, if there's nothing further.
So moved. Adjourn.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you, everyone.